Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had with Joe Saward, one of Formula One's most independent and insightful journalists. Listener Drew asks, if you could put every current driver in the same generation of car for one race, which era would you choose? As you'll hear, it's a question that quickly becomes something bigger. What does pure driving talent actually mean? And can any car truly reveal it? But before we get to our conversation, I need to ask, can you help us out? If this show adds value to your F1 experience, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app. Share this episode with other F1 fans. That's how people find us, and it's how we keep growing this community. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Okay, gentlemen, today we have a question actually from Drew, and I think it's a fascinating question, which is if you could pick any generation F1 car to have all current drivers compete in a race, which generation would you pick and why? I think this is really asking which car generation is the purest test of driver skill and when does technology help or hide talent. So before we pick an era, I want to ask, what does pure driving talent even mean? Is it car control, racecraft, consistency, speed over one lap, tire management? Because different eras reward different skills. Dick, I want to start with you. What are your thoughts on pure driving talent?
Well, I think pure driving talent encompasses a lot of things. I don't think it just means, are you quick over a lap? Sure, that's important, but there's a lot of guys that were maybe not the best qualifier, but they were usually there or thereabouts, and occasionally they'd sneak in for a pole position or something like that. But over the course of a season, they just delivered consistent results. In other words, if they had a car that at that day was the fourth best car on the grid, then if they got third or fourth, they actually delivered what needed to be delivered. And when they had a car capable of winning, they won. Um, to me, that's kind of what it's all about because you can miss the setup just a little bit, and everybody is so on their game that missing it just a little bit um, can oftentimes be the difference between first and fifth. So if you've got a fifth place car and you finished fifth, you extracted everything out of the car that you could. Um, so I think that it's really, really difficult. The other part though, and this is the old school curmudgeon that racer that I am, you know, people, in my opinion, I can't wait to hear what Joe thinks because this is going to be amazing. But um, I think people still talk about Senna 30 odd years after his passing and with this kind of reverence because he was the guy that tamed that howling, nasty, all over the road Honda and used it to such great effect. Whereas today's cars are, I refer to them as sterile. Um, sure, they're a whole bunch faster and they're way more sophisticated and they're safer and blah blah, all that. They're more everything, right? And yet they're just not very dramatic. You don't need earplugs to go to a Formula One race anymore, that kind of stuff. And so I think some of it has to do with being able to go and kind of, you know, tame the beast. I mean, clearly a guy like Lewis Hamilton, so quick. And yes, he had the best car for many, many years, but at the end of the day, he always delivered. Right? And so, yeah, statistically, great, most accomplished of all, right? Is he the greatest of all time? He's certainly one of the greatest, but how do you compare him to a Jim Clark or a Jackie Stewart or a Senna or really even Schumacher? So, yeah, I think every era maybe had cars that brought out the best of one or two guys. And yet there's things about each era that I thought were really, really cool. For me, I kinda like the cars of the late '80s, early '90s, the V10s and, I mean, they were horribly dangerous, but oh my goodness, they were spectacular. So that's me.
Okay. Joe, what's your perspective? Agree, disagree, or have a different take?
I disagree on a number of respects. One of them, let's get that one out of the way first, which is the noise thing. I understand people saying that noise is important, and I don't agree with that actually, because you want to grow the audience, and if you want to grow the audience, you don't take your kids along. No mum, no responsible mother takes her children and gets their ears blown out. Therefore, you're half the audience. So ever since we've had quieter cars, the audiences have grown. So that's just a side point. But I think that's an important point to have.
I think that's a very good point that I've never even thought about because I'm very much enamored with a normally aspirated engine at 16,000 revs. But you know what? You're not wrong.
What are we there for? You know, that's the whole point. The reason we were just discussing before, we're all a bit deaf if we've been in racing for a long time, and that's because of that engine. Honestly, it is. Everybody I've known who was around the screaming era has been deaf, or ever so slightly deaf, or depending on how old you are, it just gets worse. Anyway, that's another point. On in terms of eras and speed and all the rest of it, I would say that I follow the Niki Lauda principle, which is the best racing driver is the fastest one, and I think that the key point there in the whole process is the greatest drivers are the ones who get more out of the car than the car is willing to give them. So the idea of you did the best that the car can do, I don't agree with that because there's always drivers who can go just get a little bit more, and they're the magic guys. And then beyond that, I think the best way to explain my view about eras is, uh, let's go back 80 years, and there were guys who flew Spitfires and Thunderbolts and planes. And there were some who were great fighter pilots and some who were not so great fighter pilots. And nowadays they fly around in F whatever it is. And because I can't even keep up on the numbers nowadays, but basically they're still great pilots. They just do different stuff. So at the end of the day, how do you count them down? How do you rate them? You can rate them on how many other planes they shot down or whatever, you know. But I don't think you can really compare, and I don't think that that really putting them into different ages really helps very much because all you're doing is saying, well, this guy was a great driver in the 50s. This guy was a great driver in the 20s, sorry, the 2000s. And this guy's a great driver today. But what are you actually comparing? They're different skills, and therefore I think that you can't really say, well, if you put Fangio in a modern car, do you think that Fangio would be the greatest racing driver? I have no idea, but I think it's an interesting thought, but we can never do it. So I know that some of the modern drivers have driven the old cars, and I've seen them do it actually, and I've seen them get out of the cars absolutely terrified of what they've been driving, because it's not their idea of what motor racing is about. And most of these guys wouldn't have raced in the 20s. Back in the old days before Grand Prix racing, they wouldn't have raced the cars because those guys were all nuts. They were all fighter pilots of in the First World War who flew around the skies in wooden boxes with wires attached and shot at each other at the same time. So different mentality. So I don't think there's any way that you can make true comparisons, and I don't think it matters which era you choose. You just got to say at this time, at that moment, this guy was the best. But I think the point, going back to it, about the guys who get more out of the machinery when their machinery is not good enough, those for me are the great drivers. Senna in '93, when he didn't have the same kind of car, and yet he won X number of races, and they were all phenomenal victories. Because you just, how the hell did he do that? And that's the kind of thing that I think is important.
Yeah, you know what? I love that actually, and I don't take exception to anything you said. I'll start there because, if I think about racing history, and I love motor racing history, right? And I grew up reading a lot of stuff, including some of your stuff. And, it was you think about, Sterling Moss at Monaco winning in a privately entered Lotus, that car had no shot. And yet he won. I mean, they took half the car, the bodywork off the car to keep it cool so he could drive in the heat and that kind of stuff. And so I think your point is great that that you have a car that is perhaps a little bit inferior, and yet the guy is able to make it go faster than he has any right to. And so, yeah, I think that's a really great point.
To go just to as a illustration of this, the very first Monaco Grand Prix, okay, 1929, so long ago, nobody cares. But Rudy Caracciolo, always deemed one of the greatest drivers ever, was driving a Mercedes, a big old Mercedes, and he was beaten that day by a guy called Williams, in inverted commas, driving a Bugatti because Williams had a better strategy, and he drove it in a way that allowed him to win. And that's what it's all about. It's about delivering victory when it seems impossible. Caracciolo was one of the greats. Nobody ever remembers Williams, but um, beat him, beat him. You showed him how to do it. And so the things that they're very, very subjective, and this is generally don't get involved in conversations about who was the greatest racing driver ever because I don't think there's any answers, and I think it's just sensible, really, because you can go on arguing for days on end about it, but there's no way of proving anything you ever say. So it's just a sort of intellectual exercise in argument.
So let me ask you, so let's redirect the question then, Joe. What were the Formula One cars, not the drivers, but the cars themselves, that you looked at them and you were like, oh man, that is a race car? Were there 4 or 5 that stick out in your mind where you just kinda go, "Oh, man, that's a great car"?
Well, I'm sadly, I think, probably old enough to remember the super turbos in the 1980s. You know, 1,500 horsepower from a 1.5 liter engine. That's 1 horsepower out of every cubic centimeter. And those things were just insane. They had ridiculous turbo lag. There were engines that blew themselves literally in half because they had so much power, and and I've seen stuff. I've seen other engines do things. I've seen one. I remember one year, and it was in the V10 era, I think, if I remember correctly. But this engine just literally turned itself into metal muesli. And I looked over the pit wall because it had happened to stuff, and there was literally just a pile of muesli and oil. And, these things are amazing bits of machinery. And anyone who drove those turbo cars, particularly given the levels of safety they had, which were completely mad, but then they didn't know any different. They didn't think differently. They don't think in the way we do now. But, so I think those were certainly from my era, those were the most extraordinary things to control. And but when people ask me what's the best era of Formula One, I always say next year, because every year the sport improves in one way or another way or whatever, and I think that's true today. And one of the things I say is that every year things go quicker. Okay, you have a rule change. There's a reset. It takes a while to get things together, but they end up being faster, and the same guys come to the front. In the end, it's just, and also the other thing is, of course, you don't have as many pay drivers anymore because they're all professional. Now, the worst driver in Formula One today, with the nicest will in the world, he's kind of a pay driver, but he's still good enough. He's good enough on podiums, and he's good enough to have taken a pole position once even. Now, I'm talking about Lance Stroll, but, he's not there because he's talented per se. He's there because, Daddy's got the money. But at the same time, he's not a bad driver. He's just not a great, and then the thing is, nowadays we have more and more every year. The drivers are better and better, and so they're being prepared better, they're being trained better, they learn, they're all just better. And so that's why I always say, and in terms of the racing, well, that's another story. How can we control that? We have to have regulations that allow for racing, but sometimes it's really hard to do that. And you can't change everything Formula One is about being at the front, being the greatest technology being the greatest drivers, being all of these things. And I think that if we compromise on that, if you go and do what NASCAR or IndyCar does, which is basically everyone gets the same car, and that's NASCAR fundamentally is the same car these days, but and, and then you play about with cautions and all the rest of it to get showbiz into the game. It's fine. People are happy watching it, but they don't have anything like the audiences globally that Formula One does. Why is that? Because people like extreme. People like the idea of this is really groundbreaking. This is amazing stuff, and I think that's really important. And I think that if Formula One ever gets to the point of going to a sort of uh, bog standard championship, it will go down the tubes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I
And
think it's really
I
interesting.
hate balance of performance regulations, by the way.
Oh my gosh, yes. Me
Absolutely
too.
hate them. And I don't even take them seriously because, you can manipulate them to have whoever you want to win can win if they don't mess it up. And, for me, that's not it's no better than just having all the same cars.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I've got a number of friends who race, in IMSA, so they're doing the sports car, GT3, that kind of thing. And they all just hate it because every couple races, something gets changed on that balance of performance. And they're just sort of like, it's just maddening. you
And
know?
now they've got rules, they're not allowed to speak out and say that.
Right.
Which which is, I mean, hello, where are we going with this?
Right.
Can't say this isn't fair, when it's patently not fair. Um, what on earth is going on with? I mean, that will be ultimately that will undermine. This is why some of the, because the other thing is when you have lots of manufacturers in the same championship, they can't all win, so some have to leave. Um, and so there's the people make a lot. There's so many manufacturers in sports car racing today, but how many of them are winning, and how many of them? This is the way. Formula One. It's funny. Somebody was saying, this is just like 2014, and uh, somebody's going to be ahead and stay ahead, whatever. We've got more manufacturers in because of the new technology. We have, as and when Cadillac turn up, and there's no logic in them turning up before 2031, no matter what they, um, but nonetheless, they're interested because they want to be in the best of the best. And they've realized, both Ford and GM, as an example, have realized that if you want to sell cars around the world, there is no better way of doing it than, because ultimately, is anybody watching an IndyCar race from, I don't know, Road America in China? No, probably not. Is there anybody watching it in Africa? Is there anybody watching it anywhere apart from in the US? Honestly, in numbers, no. Same with NASCAR. Who cares? At the end of the day, they're domestic championships. I know that sounds sort of, um, being unpleasant about. I'm not being unpleasant. I'm just talking about reality. Formula One is big everywhere, and
Yeah.
there's reason for.
Yeah. 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 For sure.
It hasn't been big in the US, actually. Just to follow up on that, the reason it hasn't been big in the US is because Formula One under Bernie Ecclestone avoided going to the US because he felt you couldn't make any money there. And that's why we didn't go to places, because he couldn't find people willing to pay for it. Now, Liberty Media, being American, have had a different approach and been very successful. And Formula One are growing massively each year. It's growing in the US. So you know, good for Formula One. But there are reasons for this, and it's not just it's not just good promotion. It's the fact that it is the best of the best. It's the Top Gun of motor racing, if you want to use silly expressions.
Right. 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 Yeah. And there's no argument there because, all the IndyCar drivers, all of them deep down inside are probably saying, man, I wish I had a shot at F1, or
If
they
they
did have a shot at F1 and they didn't get it.
if
Yeah.
they I mean, there are people in Formula E who are always banging on about how Formula E is better than everything else, and so I said, yeah, right, sorry. Yeah, whatever. And that's my view, which is whatever. If you've been good enough or had the, maybe it's just bad luck, but if you'd been in the right place at the right time in the right car, you could have been a Formula One driver. Yeah, yeah. We could all, it's, Marlon Brando, I could have been a contender, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, don't disagree with you. It's, I think it's very interesting because, like last year, if you talk about IndyCar, Alex Palou absolutely destroyed everybody because he got it right and nobody else did, and Palou's a very talented guy. Um, but, because of poor management, that guy's never gonna get a shot at F1, right? Because he's built a reputation for himself.
It's a very interesting case, the Palau case, because, um, you know, is he is he F1 top material? Which is, I mean, I tend to think he is. And at a certain point, McLaren tended to think he was. And then McLaren decided, for whatever reason, that he wasn't. And they went for Piastri instead. So why did they do that? What made them make that decision to say, no, he's not? I don't know the answer to that. But, I don't think it's got anything to do with marketing or anything, because if you're going to market something, Palau comes from Spain. What's the difference coming from Spain or from Australia, to be honest? I don't really I don't really see why that would have been that would have had an impact. Maybe it's just because you sign in IndyCar doesn't mean you're going to shine there. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I haven't sat down with McLaren and asked, why didn't you do that? But that's what that's the decision they made. So, but I think we'll see. I think this year we've got Herta coming into Formula 2. Let's see what he does. Let's see um, if he's in the league of being able to, because getting Formula 2 is tough. Do not think that he'll just sail through there because he's been an IndyCar driver, that he's going to sail through there and get to Formula 1 without a problem. I think he's going to struggle to be. I'm not saying necessarily saying top 10 in the championship, but I don't think he's going to. I don't think it's going to be easy, because these guys are all trained in European ways. They are all very talented. They are all, perhaps less experienced, but it's a tough environment. So he's lucky because he's got these the people TWG behind him who are obviously wanting to get an American in the game, because they see Americanization of a team as something that they can turn into money. But let's be honest here. These people are not necessarily doing it for the love of the sport. It might just be to get the private equity money that pushes up the value of the team. They can sell it later on.
Oh, 100%. That's exactly what's going on.
I'm aware of it, but on dare not say these things sometimes, because people get terribly upset if you say, well, it's not about waving the flag, it's about making money. But that's at the end of the day what it is.
So, I know Colton sort of. I've had a number of opportunities to sit down and visit with him, and I know his dad, Brian, as well. And there's a pretty good linkage between the Hertas and the Silers and my family. And I'm going to be real interested to see how that young man does, because he's no longer a young man in Formula 2 terms, even though, I think he's 25, 26.
He's absolutely ancient in Formula 2 terms.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is crazy.
Honest here.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to be 26 again, sort of. But anyway.
Well, it's 18-year-olds, that's the thing. I mean, this is 1920. If you're 6 years older than the guys you're fighting against, you have changed. The other thing is, of course, he's made lots of money already. And that is, whether we believe it or not, and whether they keep saying they're as hungry as ever and all the rest of it, it gives you a different balance in life, because you have different things that you worry about. And so I think, we'll see. I'm interested in lots of ways to see how he does. But I think he's clever in as much as he realizes it's not going to be easy. He's being guided by a man whose feet are very much on the ground, who is Ollie Oakes of High Tech, and he is a very, very smart, switched on guy. And as a former world karting champion himself, he knows what it takes, and he knows the good guys and the bad guys. And you know, we'll see how he does. I'm interested to see, but I think we shouldn't, certainly not in American terms. The expectations need to be moderated. And I thought launching the Cadillac car at the Super Bowl, that's a great idea promotionally wise, but are you not creating expectations among the world who doesn't know much about racing, about how America is going to come in there and dominate the world? They're not. They're going to get the back. They are going to be back, and they're going to have to work their way up, just as Haas has done over, and it's 10 years Haas has been working its way, and it's still not there. So, there's lots of different things needing to be taken into account. But I think that raising expectations is not a good idea. I think every Formula One team, if you look at the front guys, they spend their preseason time talking it all down, what they're going to do. Because they've been around the block. They know what happens. They know that if you put up, and sometimes certain teams, not mentioning any names necessarily, have been known to put in some really ridiculously fast laps before the season, so that all the people who jibber jabber about Formula One go, oh well, these guys they were fastest in testing, da-da-di-da-di-da. And it's a completely utter waste of time to do that, and it doesn't. So there you go.
Yeah, no, I agree. Sabrina, you've been very quiet.
Well, here's the thing. I have enjoyed y'all's conversations. I definitely have opinions, but we're on a time crunch and we'll have to do a part 2 to this. And I'll bring up my counterpoints because I definitely had disagreements with what y'all were saying and I want to push back a little bit. So let's do a part 2 on this. And
Yeah.
let's say thanks to Drew on presenting this question so we could have a little bit of a debate on this. And it's not ultimately, I will say this, it's not ultimately an answer to Drew's question or to what you all said. It's actually some of the tangential stuff that ended up coming out that I wanted to extrapolate a little bit more. I will say that I think that what I heard is you both agree that true talent shows regardless of the car. And we've seen drivers dominate across regulations, and identifying a car is kind of irrelevant to identifying who's the best driver, because the best driver will show up in that car. Is that a good encapsulation? Okay, so we can close out to be continued, and I look forward to our next conversation, gentlemen. Okay, friends, what did you think of this conversation? We'd love to hear from you. What questions are you wrestling with? What should we dive into next? Send them to Sabrina at 2guysagirlandf1.com. We read every single one, and frankly, your questions are usually more interesting than what we'd come up with on our own. And with that, let me say, this ends our conversation. But we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.